Mesar wiped his hands on the blood-stained apron, the familiar scent of iron and raw meat lingering in the air of his butcher shop. The day had been long, as they all were, but satisfying. He surveyed the neatly arranged cuts of meat, each one a testament to the skill he had honed over decades. His hands, though knotted with age, were steady and strong. The shop had been his life's work, a family legacy that had provided well for his children, and more recently, his grandchildren. With the sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets of the city, Mesar prepared to close up for the night. His thoughts turned, as they often did in the quiet of the evening, to the future. He had been considering retirement for some time, ready to pass the shop on to one of his children. His eldest son Norvik was the most likely candidate, responsible, steady, and already well versed in the trade. His other children had found their own paths in life, but Norvik had always been his right hand at the shop. Mesar's thoughts were interrupted by a frantic knocking at the door. The sound was sharp, desperate, and it sent a shiver of unease through him. He pulled off his apron and made his way to the door, opening it to find his grandson Jolan standing on the stoop, panting and wide-eyed. "Grandfather," Jolan gasped, his voice quivering with fear, "I've made a horrible mistake." Mesar's heart sank at the sight of the boy. Jolan had always been the wild one, impulsive, reckless, and often in trouble, but this was different. There was a terror in his eyes that Mesar had never seen before. "Come inside," Mesar said, his voice calm but firm. He led Jolan into the small parlor, the boy's hands trembling as he clutched his cloak tightly around him. "Now, tell me what's happened." Jolan hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting something, or someone, to leap out at him from the shadows. He swallowed hard, then finally spoke. I've made a pact, Grandfather, with a devil. Bel'Dranak is his name." The words tumbled out of Jolan's mouth, each one heavier than the last. "He promised me wealth, power, everything I ever wanted, but I didn't realize. I didn't understand the cost." Mesar's blood ran cold. The story of devils and their pacts were as old as time, but they were tales told to frighten children, not something one expected to encounter in reality. Yet here was his grandson, visibly shaken, confessing to having entered into such a dark contract. "What did you promise him, Jolan?" Mesar asked, his voice a low growl. He feared the answer, but he knew he had to hear it. "My soul," Jolan whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I thought it was just a joke, just words. But now he's coming for it. He's coming for me, Grandfather." Mesar felt a surge of anger at Jolan for his foolishness, but also at the devil who had ensnared him. But beneath that anger was a deeper emotion. Love. Jolan was his grandson, blood of his blood, and Mesar could not stand by and let him be dragged into the depths of the hells. "Tell me everything," Mesar demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jolan took a shuddering breath and began to recount the tale. He had been out drinking with friends, as he often did, when a stranger approached him. The man, tall with sharp features and eyes that seemed to glint with a malevolent light, had offered Jolan the world, riches, influence, women, all the things Jolan had always desired but could never attain. In his drunken state, Jolan had agreed, thinking it nothing more than a harmless jest. But the moment the pact was sealed, Jolan had felt a chill in his bones, a chill that had not left him since. Bel'Dranak appeared to me later that night, Jolan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. He said the pact was binding, that my soul belonged to him now. I tried to refuse, to say I didn't mean it, but he just laughed. He said he would come for me in 3 days' time. How long ago was this? Mesar asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. 2 days, Jolan replied, his eyes wide with terror. He'll come for me tomorrow night. Mesar stood, his mind racing. He could not allow this to happen. There had to be a way to save Jolan, to undo the pact. And if there wasn't, Mesar would find another way. I won't let him take you, Mesar said, his voice firm with resolve. I will find this Bel'Dranak and make him release you from the pact. But how, grandfather? Jolan asked, his voice trembling. He's a devil. What can you do against that? Mesar's eyes hardened. I've dealt with death all my life, Jolan. A devil is just another beast to be butchered. That night, after Jolan had fallen into a fitful sleep in the guest room, Mesar prepared for what he knew would be the most dangerous task of his life. He took an old iron-bound book from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. The book had been his wife's, handed down through her family for generations. It was filled with ancient rites and incantations, things Mesar had never believed in until now. He flipped through the pages until he found the section on summoning. The language was archaic, but Mesar had been a learned man in his youth, and he deciphered the instructions carefully. He would need to summon Bel'Dranak, call the devil to him, and then try to negotiate for Jolan's soul. It was a fool's errand, he knew, but there was no other choice. Mesar gathered the necessary materials: salt, candles, a knife, and a piece of parchment. He cleared the table in the middle of the room and began drawing the circle, marking it with symbols that made his skin crawl just to look at. As he worked, he felt a presence in the room, a coldness that seeped into his bones, but he pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. Finally, the circle was complete. Mesar lit the candles and placed them at the points of the pentagram he had drawn within the circle. He took a deep breath, then pricked his finger with the knife, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the parchment. The book had warned that blood was necessary for the summoning, a symbol of life and death, the currency of the soul. Holding the parchment in one hand, Mesar began to chant the incantation, his voice low and steady. The words felt strange on his tongue, like speaking in a language he had never known but somehow remembered. As he spoke, the air in the room grew thick, the shadows deepening, the candles flickering as if caught in a sudden gust of wind. And then, with a sound like the tearing of fabric, the figure of Bel'Dranak appeared in the center of the circle. The devil was tall, impossibly so, his head nearly brushing the ceiling. His skin was ashen, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Horns curled back from his forehead, and his mouth was filled with sharp, gleaming teeth. He wore a robe of shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse as if alive. Despite the terror that gripped Mesar's heart, he stood firm, meeting the devil's gaze. "Who dares summon me?" Bel'Dranak's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It reverberated through the room, making the walls tremble. "I am Mesar," the old butcher said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "You made a pact with my grandson, Jolan. I have summoned you to negotiate the terms." Bel'Dranak's lip curled into a cruel smile. "Ah, the boy. Yes, his soul will make a fine addition to my collection. But what makes you think I would be willing to negotiate, mortal?" Mesar clenched his fists, his mind racing for the right words. "Because I have something better to offer." The devil's eyes narrowed, glowing with a malevolent curiosity. "And what could that be?" "Me," Mesar said, the word falling heavily from his lips. "Take my soul instead of him. Let him go, and I will serve you in whatever way you see fit." For a moment there was silence, and then Bel'Dranak threw back his head and laughed. The sound was chilling, echoing off the walls like the tolling of a death knell. "You would sacrifice yourself for the boy?" the devil asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "How noble of you! How foolish!" Mesar stood his ground. "He is my blood. His life is just beginning, while mine is nearing its end. Take me, and let him go." Bel'Dranak studied Mesar for a long moment, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Very well," the devil said, his voice like the crackle of a dying fire. "I will accept your offer, but there is a condition." Mesar's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Name it." "The boy's soul will be spared," Bel'Dranak began, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. "But only if you deliver 3 souls to me before the next full moon. Fail, and both your soul and his will be mine." Mesar felt the weight of the devil's words pressing down on him. He had expected danger, but the enormity of the task was more than he had anticipated. Still, he could not back down now. He had to protect Jolan, no matter the cost. 3 souls, Mesar repeated, his voice rough with determination. "I accept." Bel'Dranak's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. "Very good, Mesar. The pact is sealed." He extended a clawed hand, and as Mesar shook it, a burning pain shot up his arm. When he looked down, he saw a dark mark seared into his skin, a twisted symbol that pulsed with a sickly light. "Remember," the devil said, his voice a low growl,
3 souls. By the next full moon, I will be watching.
And with that, Bel'Dranak vanished, leaving behind only the lingering scent of brimstone and the oppressive weight of the pact. Mesar stood alone in the parlor, his hands still stinging from the devil's touch. The candles had burned down to mere stubs, and the room felt colder than before. He knew what he had to do, but the reality of it weighed heavily on him. 3 souls. He would have to take 3 lives to save Jolan. The thought made him sick to his core, but he had no choice. He had made his decision. The next morning, Mesar rose before dawn, his mind heavy with the burden of the pact. He moved through his morning routine with the precision of years of practice, but his thoughts were far from the familiar tasks of butchery. As he sharpened his knives, he thought of the people in the city, his customers, neighbors, those who trusted him. Could he really take the lives of innocents to save his grandson? The question gnawed at him, but every time he considered backing out, he remembered Jolan's terrified face and the promise he'd made. As the sun rose, Mesar made his way to the market. The city was beginning to stir, merchants setting up their stalls, the smell of fresh bread and morning dew in the air. Mesar walked among them, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, who might fit the grim task before him. It was then that he saw her, an old beggar woman huddled in the corner near the edge of the market. She was thin, her face gaunt and lined with age, her clothes little more than rags. She was known in the city, a familiar sight, always muttering to herself as she begged for coins or scraps of food. Most people ignored her, treating her as part of the background of the city, something to be overlooked. Mesar approached her slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. She looked up as he neared, her eyes cloudy with age, but still sharp enough to recognize him.
"Mesar,"
she rasped, her voice like dry leaves.
"what brings you here so early?"
"I've come to offer you food,"
Mesar said, forcing a smile onto his face.
"And perhaps a place to rest. You shouldn't be out here in the cold."
The old woman looked at him suspiciously, but hunger won out over caution.
I'll take your offer. It's been a long time since anyone's shown me kindness."
Mesar helped her to her feet, his stomach churning with guilt. As he led her back to his shop, he tried to silence the voice in his head that screamed at him to stop, to find another way. But there was no other way. He had to protect Jolan. Once inside the shop, Mesar led the woman to the back, where the warmth of the stove and the smell of cooking meat filled the air. He prepared a small meal for her, setting it down on the table with trembling hands.
"Eat,"
he said, his voice thick with emotions.
"It's on the house."
The old woman looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing. Mesar watched her, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Could he really do this? Could he really take her life? But as the minutes passed, the mark on his hand began to burn, a reminder of the pact he had made. Time was running out. He had to act. With a heavy heart, Mesar reached for his knife. The blade glinted in the dim light of the shop, and for a moment he hesitated. But then he thought of Jolan, and the fear in his grandson's eyes gave him the resolve he needed. Mesar moved swiftly, his years of practice guiding his hand. The old woman never saw it coming. One quick, clean cut, and it was over. She slumped forward, her body falling limply onto the table. Mesar stood there, staring at the blood on his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had taken a life. The realization hit him like a hammer. He staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But there was no time for regret. He had to complete the ritual to ensure that the soul was delivered to Bel'Dranak. Mesar knelt beside the old woman's body, drawing the symbol from the book on the floor with her blood. He muttered the incantation, his voice shaking, and as he spoke the final words, he felt a cold wind sweep through the room. The mark on his hand flared with a blinding light, and the old woman's body convulsed before going still. The air grew thick, and Mesar felt a presence in the room. Bel'Dranak was watching, waiting. The light from the mark dimmed, and Mesar knew the first soul had been claimed. Mesar didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours until dawn sitting in his chair, staring at the blood-stained floor, his mind numb with horror. The old woman's body had disappeared, leaving no trace of the terrible act he had committed, but the memory of it was seared into his mind. He had one soul, but two more were needed. The thought made him sick, but there was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and he would see it through. The next day, Mesar moved through the city like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his thoughts consumed by the task ahead. He knew he could not take another innocent life, not like the old woman. He had to find someone who deserved it, someone whose death would not weigh so heavily on his soul. It was late in the afternoon when he found his target. The man was a known thief and thug, a brute who terrorized the poorer districts of the city. He was notorious for his cruelty, having beaten and robbed countless people over the years. The city guard had tried to catch him many times, but he was slippery, always managing to evade capture. Mesar followed the man through the winding streets, his heart pounding in his chest. The man was drunk, stumbling through the alleyways, laughing to himself as he pocketed the coins he had stolen from some unfortunate soul. Mesar waited until the man turned down a deserted alley, then made his move. He approached the man from behind, his knife hidden in the folds of his cloak. The man turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Mesar standing there. "Who the hell are you?" the man snarled, his hand reaching for the dagger at his belt. Mesar didn't give him the chance. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light of the alley. The man tried to fight back, but he was drunk and slow, and Mesar was quick and precise. The knife found its mark, sinking deep into the man's chest. The man let out a strangled gasp, his eyes widening in shock and pain. He staggered back, clutching at the wound, but it was too late. Mesar twisted the knife, and the man crumbled to the ground, his lifeblood pooling around him. Mesar stood over the body, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He felt nothing, no guilt, no remorse, just a cold, hollow emptiness. This man had been a monster, a predator who had preyed on the weak. His death was a necessary evil, a sacrifice to save Jolan. Once again, Mesar performed the ritual, drawing the symbol with the man's blood and muttering the incantation. The mark on his hand flared to life, and the man's body convulsed before going still. The air grew cold, and Mesar felt the presence of Bel'Dranak once more. The second soul had been claimed. 2 souls were now in Bel'Dranak's grasp, but Mesar's heart was heavier than ever. He had thought the taking of the life of a villain would ease his conscience, but the emptiness inside him only grew. He had become a killer, and no matter the justification, the blood on his hands was a stain that could never be washed away. The days passed in a haze for Mesar, each one bringing him closer to the full moon and the deadline imposed by Bel'Dranak. 2 souls had been claimed, but the burden of those deaths weighed heavily on his conscience. He had justified the second killing by telling himself the man deserved it, but the act had still left him hollow and broken. He was no longer just a butcher. He was a murderer. As the night of the full moon approached, Mesar found himself tormented by nightmares. He saw the faces of the old beggar woman and the thief, their lifeless eyes accusing him, condemning him for the choices he'd made. The weight of his deeds was crushing, but he had no choice. He had to find one more soul to deliver to Bel'Dranak. Mesar's thoughts turned, as they often did in his darkest moments, to his family. He thought of his children, his grandchildren, and the life he'd built for them. The butcher shop had been his legacy, a symbol of the hard work and sacrifice that had sustained them all. Now that legacy was tainted with blood. On the final day, as the sun began to set and the shadows grew long, Mesar made his way to the outskirts of the city. There, on the edge of a desolate field, stood a small, crumbling shack. It had once been a home, but now it was little more than a ruin, forgotten by time and the world. Inside the shack lived an old man, a hermit who had withdrawn from society years ago. He was known to the people of the city, but he was shunned for his strange behavior and reclusive ways. Rumors abounded that he had once been a scholar tormented by vampires, a man of great knowledge, and that in escaping them he had driven himself mad, eventually retreating from the world. Mesar had heard these stories many times over the years, but he had never given them much thought. Now, as he approached the shack, he felt a chill run down his spine. This man, whoever he was, would be the final offering to Bel'Dranak. The door to the shack creaked open as Mesar pushed it, revealing a dim interior cluttered with books, scrolls, and strange artifacts. The air was thick with dust. The only light came from a single sputtering candle on a rickety table. The old man sat in a corner, hunched over a tome that seemed ancient, his long gray hair hanging in tangled strands around his face. He looked up at Mesar as he entered the room, his eyes sharp and clear, despite his apparent age. "What brings you here, butcher?" the old man asked, his voice surprisingly strong. "I've no need for meat." Mesar hesitated, his hands trembling as it rested on the hilt of his knife. The old man's gaze bore into him, as if he could see the darkness lurking in Mesar's heart.
"I've come to offer you a way out,"
Mesar said, his voice strained.
"A chance to end your suffering. to be free of this life.
The old man's lip twisted into a bitter smile.
You think I suffer? You think I'm trapped here against my will?
Mesar swallowed hard, the knife feeling heavier in his hand.
I don't want to do this, but I have no choice. I need your soul.
The old man's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You've made a pact, haven't you? I can see it in your eyes. The mark of a devil is upon you. Mesar felt a cold sweat break out on his brow.
Yes, I've made a pact, and if I don't deliver your soul, my grandson will be taken instead.
The old man was silent for a moment, his gaze never leaving Mesar's. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he closed the book he had been reading and set it aside.
Do what you must, Butcher,
the old man said, his voice resigned.
But know this, the devil's bargains are never truly fulfilled. Even if you deliver me to him, he will find a way to keep you in his grasp.
Mesar's heart pounded in his chest. The old man's words were ringing in his ears, but he had come too far, and the weight of his previous actions pressed him forward. With a shaking hand, he drew his knife and stepped closer.
I'm sorry,
Mesar whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The old man closed his eyes, offering no resistance as Mesar struck. The blade slid in easily, and the old man let out a shuddering breath before falling still. Mesar dropped to his knees, the weight of his actions finally overwhelming him. He had taken 3 lives, all to save Jolan, and the cost had been his own humanity. Tears filled his eyes as he performed the final ritual, drawing the symbol with the old man's blood and speaking the incantation. The mark on Mesar's hand flared with an intense light, and the air in the shack grew cold and heavy. Mesar could feel Bel'Dranak's presence, stronger than ever as the old man's soul was claimed. Mesar remained on his knees, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the darkness to lift. But instead of relief, a cold, sinister laughter filled the room. Mesar looked up, and there stood Bel'Dranak, more vivid and imposing than ever, his shadowy form filling the entire shack.
Well done, Mesar,
the devil purred, his voice oozing with dark amusement.
You have fulfilled your end of the bargain. The boy's soul is spared.
Mesar's shoulders slumped with exhaustion and despair. It was over, but the emptiness inside him only deepened. He had lost everything, his honor, his soul, and his peace of mind.
Now,
Mesar said, his voice hoarse,
our deal is done. Leave my family alone, as you promised.
Bel'Dranak's grin widened, revealing rows of sharp teeth.
Ah, but there is something you misunderstand, my dear Butcher. The pact we made was only the beginning.
Mesar's blood ran cold.
What do you mean?
The devil's eyes glinted with cruel delight.
You see, I find your services quite useful, Mesar. You have a talent for delivering souls, and it would be a shame to let that talent go to waste. So here is my new offer. You will continue to serve me, delivering souls to my collection for the rest of your natural life.
Mesar's heart skipped a beat.
No, no. I fulfilled my part of the bargain. You can't do this. Oh, but I can.
Bel'Dranak hissed, his voice dripping with malice.
And if you refuse, I will take not only your life, but the lives of your entire family, your children, your grandchildren. They will all suffer for your defiance.
Mesar's world crumbled around him. He had sacrificed so much to protect his family, and now it seemed he had only damned them further. The weight of the devil's threat crushed any hope he had left.
Please,
Mesar whispered, his voice breaking.
Please don't do this.
Bel'Dranak's laughter echoed through the room, the sound filled with cruel triumph.
You have no choice, Butcher. Accept my terms, or watch your family perish.
Mesar's hand trembled as he stared into Bel'Dranak's eyes. He saw no mercy, no possibility of escape, only the endless torment that awaited him if he refused. With a heavy heart, Mesar bowed his head, the last shred of his spirit shattered.
I accept.
The mark on his hand flared once more, sealing the new pact. Bel'Dranak's laughter faded, and the devil's form began to dissipate, leaving Mesar alone in the darkness of the shack.
You will continue to serve, Mesar. I will always be watching.
Mesar stumbled out of the shack, the night's cold air biting against his skin. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape. But to Mesar, the world had never felt darker. He had saved Jolan, but at the cost of how many lives to come? The weight of his deeds pressed down on him, threatening to crush him completely. He had become the servant of a devil, bound to deliver souls for the rest of his life, or risk the deaths of his entire family. As he walked through the empty streets, Mesar knew that he could never return to the life he had known. The butcher shop, once a place of pride and hard work, now seemed like a distant memory, a relic of a life that was no longer his. He thought of his children, his grandchildren, and the future he had once hoped to give them. That future was now tainted, shadowed by the darkness that had claimed him. But as long as they were safe, as long as they remained untouched by Bel'Dranak's grasp, Mesar would bear the burden. And so, Mesar continued to walk, the mark on his hand burning with each step, a constant reminder of the pact that bound him. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving, as he began his grim work anew. For Mesar, there would be no rest, no peace, only the endless pursuit of souls, a task that would haunt him until his dying breath. And even then, he knew, Bel'Dranak would be waiting, ready to claim the final price.